What would it feel like to wake up tomorrow morning and find frost etched across the inside of your bedroom window? To see your own breath in the dim light of dawn, not because you're outside, but because you're lying in your own bed. To pull on clothes still stiff with yesterday's cold, knowing that warmth, real warmth, is a luxury you simply cannot afford. Tonight, we're stepping back into the quiet streets of Victorian Britain, where winter's chill pressed into every stone wall and every breath of frost lingered in the air. We'll drift through the daily struggles of ordinary people without warmth, the quiet endurance of one remarkable life, the mysteries hidden in their culture, and the stark contrasts of those who lived wrapped in comfort above it all. Before we begin, take a slow breath and settle in. If this kind of storytelling helps you unwind, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe, only if it genuinely brings you peace. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? There's something quietly comforting about knowing so many of us are drifting off together from different places. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum, and let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. Imagine yourself there, in the year 1875, in a narrow street somewhere between the Thames and the smoke-darkened spires of London. The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with frost that never quite melts even at midday. Your home, if you can call it that, is a single room on the third floor of a building that leans against its neighbor like an exhausted person seeking support. The rhythm of your days begins before dawn, not by choice, but because sleep becomes impossible when the cold seeps through every crack in the walls, every gap around the window frame, every thin spot in the blankets you've pulled over your head. You wake because your body simply cannot ignore the chill any longer. Your breath forms small clouds in the darkness as you lie there, reluctant to leave the small pocket of warmth you've created beneath layers of whatever cloth you could find. A worn wool blanket your grandmother gave you, a coat that's seen too many winters, perhaps even yesterday's newspaper pressed against your chest for that extra barrier against the cold. The window beside your narrow bed is etched with intricate patterns of ice, not on the outside, where you might expect it, but on the inside of the glass. The frost has painted delicate ferns and spirals across the pane, beautiful in their own way, but a constant reminder that the world outside and the world inside your room are separated by little more than hope and a few thin panes of glass. Your mattress is nothing more than straw stuffed into a rough cloth sack, and by morning that straw has absorbed the moisture from your breath, your body, the damp air itself. It feels cold and slightly soggy beneath you, not the dry, clean cold of winter air, but the penetrating dampness that seems to reach into your bones and settle there. Rising from this bed requires a kind of courage that people in warmer times and places might struggle to understand. You must force yourself to leave that small cocoon of relative warmth and stand on a floor made of rough wooden planks that feel like ice beneath your bare feet. The shock of it travels up your legs and you dance quickly from foot to foot, searching for your boots, if you're fortunate enough to own a pair that still holds together. Your clothing from yesterday hangs on a nail driven into the wall, and overnight it has become stiff with cold. The fabric feels almost brittle as you pull it on, layer after thin layer, each piece of cloth a small barrier against the persistent chill. Your shirt, your trousers or skirt, your vest or shawl, all of it slightly damp from yesterday's wear, all of it reluctant to bend and move with your body until your own warmth slowly brings it back to life. The process of getting dressed is a careful choreography. You must put on each garment quickly before the cold air can steal away what little warmth you've managed to generate. Your fingers, already beginning to stiffen, fumble with buttons and laces. The metal buckles and fasteners are so cold they almost burn against your skin. If you're lucky enough to have a single candle, you light it now, not just for the small circle of flickering light it provides, but for the tiny amount of warmth that dances around the flame. You hold your hands near it for a moment, watching the shadows play across the walls, feeling that small gift of heat against your palms. But candles cost money, and money is something that slips away as quickly as warmth, so you blow it out after just a few precious minutes. The rhythm of your days is shaped entirely by the search for warmth and the need to preserve what little heat you can generate or find. Every decision, where to go, how to move, what to do with your hands, is influenced by the cold that has settled into your life like an unwelcome but permanent resident. Your breakfast, if you can call it that, consists of whatever you managed to save from yesterday. Perhaps a bit of bread, hard now and cold, that you soften by dunking it in a cup of weak tea made from leaves you've used 3 times before. The tea itself is barely warm. You can't afford enough fuel to keep the small iron grate in your room burning long enough to heat water properly. So you sip liquid that's more the memory of warmth than actual heat, and you're grateful for even that. The bread tastes of nothing much, flour and water, and the faint staleness that comes from sitting out in cold, damp air. But you eat it slowly, methodically, making it last, because you know it may be hours before you taste anything else. Your body craves the warmth that food can provide, but even eating becomes a challenge when your hands are stiff and your jaw aches from the persistent cold. As you prepare to face the day outside, you wrap yourself in whatever additional layers you can find. A scarf, really just a strip of wool worn thin from too much use, a shawl that once belonged to someone else, passed down or picked up from somewhere you'd rather not remember. Mittens with holes in the fingertips because you need to be able to use your hands for the work that might, if you're lucky, earn you enough for a hot meal and a small piece of coal. The door to your room sticks in its frame. The wood has swollen with moisture and cold, and when you finally force it open, you're greeted not by relief, but by air that's somehow even colder than what you're leaving behind. The hallway is a wind tunnel, drafts flowing through gaps in the building's construction, carrying with them the smells of too many people living too close together, all of them struggling with the same basic challenge of staying warm enough to survive another day. Your footsteps echo on the wooden stairs as you make your way down, each step creaking under your weight, the sound sharp in the cold air. Other doors along the hallway remain closed, but you can hear the sounds of life behind them, someone coughing, the thin cry of a baby, the murmur of voices discussing how to make a single lump of coal last until evening. The street outside is a world painted in shades of grey and brown and the dull white of frost. The Thames fog has rolled in during the night, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke and something else, something organic and slightly sour that you've learned not to think about too carefully. The fog clings to everything, muffling sounds and making the familiar streets seem foreign and uncertain. Your work, whatever form it takes, requires you to expose yourself to this world. If you're a washerwoman, your day begins with plunging your hands into water so cold it makes your bones ache, scrubbing clothes against rough stones until your knuckles are raw and bleeding slightly. The soap, when you can afford it, stings against your cracked skin, and the wet clothes you're washing seem to steal warmth directly from your body through your hands. If you're a match seller, you stand on corners with a tray of sulphur-tipped sticks, watching your breath mix with the fog, calling out your wares to people who hurry past with their chins tucked into their collars and their hands buried deep in their pockets. Your feet go numb first, then your legs up to the knees, and eventually you lose feeling in your fingers as well, making it difficult to handle the small copper coins that customers occasionally press into your palm. The rhythm of your days becomes a careful balance between earning enough to eat and staying warm enough to continue working. You learn to move constantly, shifting your weight from foot to foot, flexing your fingers inside whatever gloves or mittens you possess, rubbing your hands together when no one is looking. These small movements become as automatic as breathing, tiny acts of defiance against the cold that never stops pressing in around you. Children in your world develop a particular kind of resilience, but also a particular kind of vulnerability. They dart through the streets like small, determined spirits, their faces red with cold, their clothes insufficient, but their energy somehow unlimited. They play games that involve running and jumping, not for fun alone, but because movement generates warmth. They huddle together in doorways and under bridges, sharing body heat the way adults might share coins. Some children work as chimney sweeps, climbing up into the narrow flues of wealthy homes where fires burn brightly. The irony is bitter. They're surrounded by the evidence of warmth, covered in the ashes of coal that provides heat. They'll never fully experience themselves. They emerge from their work, black with soot, their small bodies having navigated spaces barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, all so that others might sit comfortably beside roaring fires. The food that sustains you through these cold months is simple, often repetitive, and rarely warm enough to provide the comfort your body craves. Potatoes boiled in whatever pot you can manage to heat, eaten with your fingers because they're the only part of the meal that holds any warmth. Thin soup made from bones you've begged from the butcher, simmered with whatever vegetables you can afford or find. Turnips, cabbage, perhaps an onion if you're fortunate. Bread becomes a luxury when fuel is scarce. The local baker's shop windows glow with warmth and fill with the rich scent of yeast and flour, but the price of fresh bread often means choosing between eating well and staying warm. So you buy day-old loaves when you can, or hard biscuits that require soaking in whatever liquid you have available. The evenings bring a different kind of challenge. As darkness falls early, winter days are short and often grey, you return to your single room carrying whatever you've managed to earn or gather during the day. If you're lucky, you have enough coins for a small amount of coal or a bundle of wood scraps. If not, you burn whatever you can find, paper, perhaps a broken piece of furniture, anything that might provide a few minutes of blessed warmth. The small iron grate in your room becomes the center of your evening ritual. You build your fire carefully, not because you're particular about how it looks, but because every piece of fuel must be used as efficiently as possible. You light it with precious matches, nursing the flames until they catch hold, then sit as close as you dare, rotating slowly like meat on a spit, trying to warm every part of your body before the fuel burns away. This is when you do whatever mending needs doing, repairing tears in your clothes, darning holes in your stockings, trying to extend the life of boots that have already been patched several times. The firelight gives you just enough illumination to see what you're doing, and the warmth makes it possible for your fingers to grip needle and thread with something approaching precision. But fuel burns quickly, and all too soon the fire dies down to embers, then to ash, and the cold begins its familiar creep back into the room. You prepare for sleep by gathering whatever materials you can find, newspapers to stuff between your clothes and your body, additional garments to pile on top of your thin blanket, perhaps a heated brick if you've managed to warm one thoroughly while your fire was burning. The sounds of night in your neighborhood are the sounds of collective struggle, coughing echoes through thin walls, the persistent, racking cough that comes from breathing cold, damp air for months on end. Children cry, their voices thin and sometimes desperate. Adults speak in low, worried tones about money, about work, about how to make what little they have stretch until spring finally arrives. Sleep itself becomes a skill you must learn. You discover how to curl your body into the position that conserves the most heat, how to breathe slowly and steadily so that your exhaled breath doesn't create too much moisture under your covers, how to remain still even when every instinct tells you to move, to generate warmth through motion. Sometimes you wake in the middle of the night, jolted into consciousness by the cold that has settled into your bones while you slept. Your feet are numb, your hands curled into claws that ache when you try to straighten your fingers. You lie there, waiting for dawn, listening to the sounds of other people experiencing the same struggle, drawing what comfort you can from the knowledge that you're not facing this alone. The community that forms around shared hardship has its own quiet rhythms. Neighbors who might otherwise have little in common find themselves bound together by their mutual struggle against the cold. You share information which coal merchant might have scraps available cheaply, where someone might find work that pays in both coins and warmth, how to treat chilblains and frostbite with whatever remedies you can afford or make yourself. There's a particular solidarity among those who understand what it means to choose between eating and staying warm. You recognize it in the way someone holds their body, in the practiced efficiency with which they move through their daily tasks, in the careful way they speak about fuel and food, and the small luxuries that others take for granted. Your relationship with weather becomes intensely personal. You watch the sky not for beauty, but for signs of what's coming, more snow that will make walking difficult, clear skies that might mean colder nights, wind that will find every gap in your shelter and steal away whatever warmth you've managed to accumulate. You learn to read clouds like a farmer reads soil, understanding their meanings in ways that connect directly to your survival. The rhythm of your days, week after week, month after month, creates a kind of endurance that's both impressive and heartbreaking. You develop strategies for preserving energy, for finding warmth in unexpected places, for maintaining hope when everything around you seems designed to wear away at your spirit. You learn to find satisfaction in small victories, a day when you earn enough for both food and fuel, a night when you sleep without shivering, a morning when the sun breaks through the fog and provides a few minutes of actual warmth. As winter deepens and extends, stretching from November through March and sometimes into April, the challenge becomes not just physical, but psychological. The cold becomes a constant companion, shaping how you think about everything else in your life. Plans are made around staying warm. Relationships are influenced by who can provide shelter or fuel, or simply the comfort of shared body heat. Yet somehow, in the midst of all this hardship, life continues. People fall in love, though courtship might involve sharing a cup of tea in a warm public house rather than taking leisurely walks. Children learn and play, though their games are adapted to the reality of cold streets and insufficient clothing. Communities celebrate, though their festivals center around shared fires and communal meals designed as much for warmth as for joy. The quiet endurance required to survive a Victorian winter without adequate heat shapes character in ways that are both admirable and tragic. It teaches patience, resourcefulness, and a deep appreciation for small comforts. But it also wears away at health, at hope, and at the possibilities that life might offer beyond the immediate challenge of staying warm enough to see another day. As the fog settles deeper over the gaslit streets, let us shift our attention from the anonymous struggles of the many to the extraordinary story of one woman whose voice has somehow reached across more than a century to speak to us directly. Her name was Hannah Culwick, and in the careful pages of her diary, written by candlelight in servants' quarters throughout Victorian England, she left us a window into a life lived entirely in the shadow of others' comfort. Hannah was born in 1833 in the quiet countryside of Shropshire, where winter arrived early and stayed late, painting the rolling hills in shades of grey and brown that would become the backdrop for much of her understanding of the world. She was the daughter of a saddler, a respectable trade, but one that provided little warmth when the cold months settled in around their modest home. From the very beginning, Hannah's relationship with cold was different from the one we explored in our first journey together. While the urban poor fought the chill in crowded tenements and narrow streets, Hannah's battle was fought in the grand houses of the wealthy, where warmth existed in abundance, but remained forever just beyond her reach. Imagine yourself in her place at the age of 8, when she first entered domestic service. Picture yourself as a small child, your hands already roughened by household work, standing in the servants' hall of a country house where the stone floors seemed to drink in any warmth your body might generate. The great houses of Victorian England were marvels of comfort for their owners, but for the servants who maintained them, they were labyrinths of cold corridors, unheated back stairs, and rooms where fires were never lit except when the family required them. Hannah's days began before dawn, not in a single room like our earlier companions, but in a narrow attic space shared with other servants. The servants' quarters were always located in the least desirable parts of these grand houses, tucked under the eaves where summer heat was unbearable and winter cold was inescapable, or buried in basement levels where dampness seeped through stone walls and lingered in the air like an unwelcome guest. The rhythm of her days was dictated not by her own needs, but by the comfort requirements of people she served, but rarely saw as complete human beings. She rose in darkness to light fires in rooms where others would later sit in comfort. Her hands, still stiff with sleep and cold, had to coax flames to life in grates that had grown cold overnight, building the foundation for warmth that she herself would never fully enjoy. Hannah's work as a maid of all work meant that she was responsible for every aspect of household maintenance that required physical labor. She scrubbed floors on her hands and knees, her dress soaking up the cold water that was her constant companion. She carried heavy buckets of water up and down stairs, the liquid sloshing against her skirts and freezing her legs through the thin fabric. She washed dishes in sculleries where the only heat came from the hot water she heated herself. And even that warmth was brief and localized, touching only her hands and forearms, while the rest of her body remained chilled. But Hannah was not simply a victim of her circumstances. What makes her story so quietly fascinating is the way she wrote about her experiences, revealing a complex inner life that she nurtured despite the physical demands of her work. In her diary, kept faithfully for decades, she recorded not just the tasks she performed, but her thoughts about the strange world she inhabited, a world where she was intimately familiar with every corner of grand houses, but remained invisible to most of their inhabitants. She wrote about her hands, always about her hands. They were the tools of her trade, and winter was their greatest enemy. She described them as red and swollen from constant immersion in cold water, cracked along the knuckles where the skin split from the combination of soap, cold, and endless scrubbing. She developed a particular way of holding cleaning rags that protected her palms while still allowing her to apply the pressure necessary to remove stains and dirt. Her hands were maps of her labor, and she studied them with the attention others might give to works of art. The clothes she wore were chosen for durability and practicality rather than warmth. Her dress was typically made of rough cotton or wool, designed to withstand constant washing and the wear that came from crawling, kneeling, and reaching. In winter, she layered whatever she could underneath, a thin chemise, perhaps a flannel petticoat if she was fortunate, and stockings that she darned and redarned until they were more repair than original fabric. Her boots were perhaps the most important item she owned. A good pair of boots meant the difference between feet that remained functional throughout the day and feet that became numb blocks of ice that made walking treacherous. She wrote about the process of breaking in new boots, how she would wrap her feet in cloth and wear the boots around her small room until they shaped themselves to her particular needs. But boots were expensive, and she often had to choose between footwear that fit properly and footwear she could afford. Hannah's relationship with food reveals another layer of her winter experience. While the families she served enjoyed elaborate meals prepared and served at perfect temperatures, her own nutrition came from leftovers and kitchen scraps, often eaten quickly while standing, and almost always cold by the time she had the opportunity to consume them. She wrote about the particular pleasure of being able to warm her hands around a cup of tea and how she would sometimes hold the cup long after it was empty, cherishing the lingering warmth of the ceramic against her palms. What makes Hannah's story so compelling is not just the physical hardship she endured, but the way she thought about that hardship. She took a peculiar pride in her ability to endure cold, in her capacity for hard work, in the strength of her body. She saw herself as fundamentally different from the soft, pampered people she served, and there was both resentment and satisfaction in that difference. Her diary entries reveal a woman who understood her place in the social hierarchy, but refused to accept it as a measure of her worth. She wrote about her employers with a mixture of professional respect and private disdain, observing their habits and weaknesses with the clear eyes of someone who saw them at their most vulnerable moments. She knew which family members were kind and which were cruel, who left generous tips and who treated servants as barely human, who was genuinely grateful for service and who simply expected it as their natural right. The most intriguing aspect of Hannah's life was her secret relationship with Arthur Munby, a gentleman from London who became fascinated with working-class women, particularly those whose hands bore the marks of hard labor. Their relationship lasted for decades, conducted largely through letters and clandestine meetings, and it revealed Hannah's complex understanding of her own identity. Munby was drawn to what he saw as the nobility of hard work, the beauty he found in hands roughened by labor, the strength he admired in women who could endure physical hardship. Hannah was both flattered by his attention and suspicious of his motivations. She understood that he romanticized her struggles in ways that actual experience of those struggles would quickly cure. Yet she also found in their correspondence an outlet for thoughts and feelings that she could express nowhere else. Through the long winter months, when her work was hardest and the cold most penetrating, Hannah would write letters to Munby describing her daily experiences. She wrote about the satisfaction of completing difficult tasks, about the camaraderie she sometimes found with other servants, about the small rebellions and private thoughts that sustained her through the endless round of duties. She described the peculiar intimacy of caring for people who barely acknowledged her existence. She knew the sleep patterns of family members, the sounds they made when they were ill, the particular ways they liked their rooms arranged. She was present during their most private moments, their arguments, their celebrations, their sorrows, but always as a shadow, a necessity that was expected to remain invisible. Winter intensified all of these dynamics. When the family was comfortable in heated rooms, Hannah was most aware of the cold corridors and unheated spaces where she spent her days. When they complained about minor discomforts, she bit her tongue and continued her work with hands that were sometimes so cold she could barely feel them. When they praised the warmth and comfort of their homes, she knew intimately the labor required to maintain that comfort, and how little of it extended to those who provided it. Hannah's understanding of social class was shaped by these daily contrasts. She saw wealth not as an abstract concept, but as the difference between cold hands and warm hands, between having to work in unheated spaces and being able to sit by the fire, between clothes chosen for durability and clothes chosen for comfort. Class for Hannah was measured in degrees of temperature, in the quality of food, in the freedom to rest when tired or seek warmth when cold. Yet she also recognized that her employers were not necessarily happier than she was. She observed their anxieties, their health problems, their family disputes, their social pressures. She understood that comfort could create its own form of weakness, that people who never had to endure physical hardship sometimes lacked the resilience that such endurance developed. There was a quiet superiority in her attitude toward those she served, a belief that her strength was more real and more valuable than their softness. As the years passed, Hannah's body began to show the accumulated effects of decades spent in cold, of constant immersion of her hands in water, of the repetitive motions required by her work. She developed arthritis in her fingers, making it painful to grip cleaning implements or wring out wet cloth. Her back ached from years of scrubbing floors and lifting heavy objects. Her feet, despite her careful attention to proper footwear, began to trouble her with persistent cold and occasional numbness. But even as her body grew less able to meet the physical demands of her work, Hannah continued to take pride in her capability, her endurance, her knowledge of how to manage a household efficiently. She had developed skills and insights that were genuinely valuable, even if they were undervalued by the society around her. She could organize complex cleaning schedules, manage limited resources effectively, and maintain high standards even under difficult conditions. Hannah's story illuminates the hidden foundation upon which Victorian comfort was built. Every warm room represented hours of labor by people like her. Every well-prepared meal required servants who worked in cold kitchens and sculleries. Every elegantly maintained household depended on individuals who absorbed the discomfort and physical demands that such maintenance required. In her later years, Hannah's relationship with Arthur Munby became even more complex. They eventually married in secret, a union that had to remain hidden because of the social impossibility of a gentleman openly marrying a servant. Even in marriage, Hannah continued to work, continued to define herself through labor, continued to take pride in her ability to endure hardship that others could not imagine surviving. Her diary entries from this period reveal a woman who had found a way to maintain dignity and self-respect within a system designed to deny both. She had created an identity that valued her strength, her skills, and her endurance. She had found love, even if it had to remain secret. She had carved out spaces of autonomy and self-expression, even within the constraints of servitude. The rhythm of Hannah's days, even in her later years, remained shaped by the seasonal demands of domestic work. Winter brought its familiar challenges: cold hands, cold rooms, the extra work of maintaining fires and managing heating systems. But she met these challenges with the accumulated wisdom of decades, with techniques and strategies developed through long experience, with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived countless difficult seasons. Hannah Cullwick died in 1909, having lived through more than 7 decades of social and technological change. She had seen the introduction of gas lighting, improved heating systems, and gradually changing attitudes toward domestic service. But throughout all these changes, her fundamental experience remained constant: the daily reality of working with her hands, of creating comfort for others while often going without it herself, of finding dignity and meaning in labor that society valued but rarely acknowledged. Her story reminds us that behind every heated room, every comfortable chair, every warm meal in Victorian England, there were people like Hannah whose own comfort was sacrificed to create comfort for others. The grand houses and elegant lifestyles of the Victorian upper classes were built on a foundation of individual human beings who absorbed cold, discomfort, and hardship so that others might live in warmth. Yet Hannah's legacy is not simply one of victimization. Her diaries reveal a woman who found ways to assert her humanity, to claim dignity, to build relationships, and to create meaning within circumstances that might have broken someone with less resilience. She transformed the cold, demanding work of domestic service into a source of personal strength and identity. She proved that even in the most constrained circumstances, it remains possible to maintain inner freedom, to nurture complex thoughts and feelings, and to insist on one's own worth as a human being. As we let Hannah's story settle into our consciousness like sediment in still water, we can appreciate the quiet heroism required simply to survive with dignity in a world designed to make such survival difficult. Her hands, red and swollen from cold water and harsh soap, were also the hands that wrote thousands of pages of careful, thoughtful prose. Her body, shaped by decades of physical labor, was also the vessel for a rich inner life and a complex understanding of her world. Let us now drift from daily struggle into mystery, from the documented hardships of ordinary lives into the shadowy realm of beliefs, remedies, and practices that existed at the edges of Victorian understanding. As the night deepens around us, we enter a world where the line between medicine and magic was often blurred, where desperate people reached for solutions that combined ancient wisdom with hopeful superstition. Picture yourself walking through the narrow streets of Victorian London on a December evening when the fog has rolled in thick from the Thames and gaslight creates small islands of visibility in an ocean of grey mist. The air carries more than just the smell of coal smoke and dampness. It carries whispers of old knowledge, half-remembered remedies, and beliefs that people clung to when official medicine had little to offer against winter's relentless assault on the human body. The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with moisture that seems to seep through the soles of your boots, and each breath you take forms small clouds that disappear into the larger darkness surrounding you. From the cramped windows above, you can hear the quiet sounds of families settling in for another long winter night, the scraping of chairs being moved closer to small fires, the murmur of voices sharing warmth through words when fuel is too precious to waste on comfort alone. In the small rooms and cramped tenements we visited earlier, people developed elaborate systems of protection against the cold that went far beyond the simple accumulation of clothing and fuel. These were practices passed down through generations, modified by experience, and shared in hushed conversations between neighbors who understood that survival sometimes required more than practical solutions. The rhythm of these winter evenings was punctuated by rituals that modern minds might dismiss as superstition, but which served deep psychological and sometimes genuinely practical purposes for people whose margin for error was measured in degrees of temperature and ounces of food. These rituals began before sunset, when experienced survivors would begin their preparations for the night ahead, checking and rechecking the small measures that might mean the difference between waking to another dawn or succumbing to the cold that crept through every crack and crevice. One of the most widespread practices involved the careful placement of ordinary household objects in positions believed to ward off the worst effects of winter cold. Shoes, particularly old boots that had walked many miles and absorbed the essence of their wearers' journeys, were placed in chimneys, not the grand fireplaces of wealthy homes, but the small, draughty flues of modest dwellings. The belief held that these shoes would somehow intercept the cold air descending the chimney and prevent it from stealing warmth from the room below. The logic of this practice reveals the complex relationship Victorian people had with the invisible forces they believed governed their lives. Cold was not simply the absence of heat, but a presence in itself, something that could be blocked, redirected, or confused by the right combination of objects and intentions. A boot that had carried its owner safely through previous winters was thought to retain some essence of that protection, some accumulated resistance to cold that could be deployed strategically. The selection of which boot to use was never arbitrary. Families would examine their collection of worn footwear with the seriousness of military strategists, considering which pair had proven most reliable during harsh weather which had carried their wearer through the most difficult journeys, which seemed to hold the strongest memories of warmth and safety. Sometimes the chosen boot would be one that belonged to a deceased family member, carrying not just practical protective properties but emotional resonance that strengthened the household's collective will to survive. Imagine yourself participating in this ritual, taking a worn leather boot, perhaps one with holes that make it no longer suitable for walking, and carefully positioning it in the narrow throat of your chimney. Your hands, already stiff with cold, work by feel more than sight, and there's something both practical and mystical about the act. The boot might indeed block some of the downdraft that steals warmth from your room, but it also serves as a tangible expression of your determination to survive, a physical manifestation of hope placed between your vulnerable living space and the hostile world above. The ceremony of boot placement often involved the entire family, with each member contributing something to the ritual. Children might whisper prayers or wishes into the boot before it was positioned, believing their breath would warm the leather and strengthen its protective power. Adults would sometimes place small objects inside the boots, coins for prosperity through the hard months ahead, dried flowers for the memory of spring, or tiny written prayers folded into squares so small they seemed to contain concentrated hope. Some households developed elaborate seasonal calendars that dictated when boots should be moved, rotated, or replaced in the chimney. The first placement often occurred on the night of the first hard frost, marked by ceremonies that involved the whole neighborhood. Families would emerge from their homes carrying their chosen protective boots, and there would be a quiet sharing of techniques and blessings that had proven effective in previous years. The removal of the boots was equally ceremonial, timed to coincide with the first genuinely warm day of spring. These boots, having served their protective function through the winter months, were often saved in places of honor, sometimes kept for the following year, sometimes buried in small household gardens where their accumulated protective power could benefit growing plants. The use of newspaper and printed materials as insulation was so common it became almost ritualistic. People would paste newspapers directly onto walls, creating an additional barrier against drafts, but the choice of which newspapers to use revealed deeper beliefs about the power of written words. Some favored religious publications, believing that sacred texts would provide spiritual as well as physical protection. Others chose newspapers that contained accounts of distant places where the weather was warmer, as if the descriptions of sunshine and gentle breezes might somehow influence the local climate. The application of newspaper insulation became a family art form, with different households developing signature techniques and preferences. Some families insisted that all text should face inward toward the living space, believing that words themselves generated a form of spiritual heat that would warm the room. They would spend hours selecting particular articles or passages, arranging them so that uplifting or hopeful content was positioned at eye level where it could be read during the long winter evenings. Other families preferred to face text outward, creating a barrier of words between their living space and the hostile world beyond. These households believed that written language possessed protective power that could repel harmful influences, and they would carefully choose articles that contained strong, defiant language, accounts of human triumph over adversity, stories of survival against impossible odds, descriptions of human courage and determination. The most elaborate newspaper installations involved layering different types of text in specific patterns. Religious passages might form the foundation layer closest to the wall, providing spiritual grounding for the entire protective system. Over this would be placed newspapers containing practical information, weather reports, agricultural advice, accounts of successful winter survival techniques from other regions. The outermost layer often consisted of entertainment content, serialized novels, poetry, humorous sketches, material intended to lift spirits and maintain hope during the darkest months. Children were taught to sleep with newspapers stuffed inside their clothes, but they were also taught specific ways to fold and arrange these papers. Some families insisted that text should face inward toward the body, believing that words themselves could generate warmth. Others required that text face outward, creating a barrier of language between the sleeper and the cold. These practices transformed the simple act of staying warm into a complex ritual that engaged both physical and psychological resources. The preparation of newspaper bedding became a nightly ritual that involved the entire family. Children would be taught to fold papers in precise patterns. Some families preferred accordion folds that trapped air in regular pockets. Others insisted on spiral rolls that created channels for warm air to circulate around the body. The papers would be blessed or spoken over before being placed in clothing, with family members sharing hopes for warm dreams and peaceful sleep. The most cherished pieces of text-based insulation were letters from distant family members, particularly those who lived in warmer climates. These letters would be read aloud to the family before being carefully incorporated into the household's insulation system, carrying not just physical warmth but emotional warmth that connected the family to loved ones and to places where winter was less harsh. Some households developed elaborate systems for rotating their text-based insulation, ensuring that family members had opportunities to read different materials throughout the winter. Newspapers and pamphlets would be moved from walls to clothing to bedding in carefully planned cycles, maximizing both their practical and psychological benefits. The remedies people used to treat the effects of prolonged cold exposure existed in a fascinating space between folk wisdom and emerging medical knowledge. Chilblains, the painful swelling and inflammation that resulted from repeated exposure to cold, were treated with an array of substances that revealed both practical understanding and mystical thinking. Onion poultices were among the most common treatments, and there was actually sound reasoning behind this practice. Onions contain compounds that can improve circulation and reduce inflammation when applied to the skin. But the preparation of these poultices was surrounded by specific rituals and beliefs that went beyond simple medical application. The onions had to be prepared at particular times, often just after sunset, when the boundary between day and night was believed to be most permeable to healing influences. They were sliced with knives that had been warmed by the fire, and the juices were collected in vessels that had been blessed, or at least spoken over with words of healing intention. The application of the poultice itself was accompanied by quiet chanting or prayer, creating a treatment that addressed spiritual as well as physical needs. The selection of onions for medical use involved careful consideration of their source and quality. Onions that had been grown in soil blessed by clergy were considered most potent, followed by those grown in household gardens, where they had absorbed the protective emanations of the home. Some families maintained special relationships with particular vendors, believing that onions purchased from people known for their healing touch would be more effective than those obtained through ordinary commercial transactions. Imagine yourself preparing such a remedy, your cold hands working to slice the sharp-smelling onion while your eyes water from both the vegetable's natural oils and the smoke from your small fire. The onion's warmth against your fingers provides immediate comfort, and the pungent aroma seems to clear your head and awaken your senses. As you wrap the sliced onion in cloth and prepare to apply it to your chilblained feet, you're participating in a ritual that connects you to generations of people who faced the same struggles and found the same solace in taking active steps toward healing. The cloth used to wrap onion poultices was selected with equal care, often chosen from garments that had belonged to family members known for their good health or longevity. Some households maintained special healing cloths that were used only for medical purposes, washed in water that had been blessed, and stored in places where they would absorb positive influences. The application ritual itself often involved multiple family members, with one person preparing the poultice while others offered prayers, sang healing songs, or maintained the fire that provided both practical heat and symbolic life force. The sufferer would be positioned so that the treatment could be applied while they remained as close as possible to the warming fire, creating a ceremony that addressed physical comfort, medical treatment, and spiritual healing simultaneously. Other common remedies included the use of goose grease mixed with specific herbs, applied to the chest and throat to combat the respiratory ailments that were common during cold months. The goose grease had to be collected from birds that had been raised with particular care, fed on specific diets that included herbs believed to enhance the healing properties of their fat. The herbs mixed with goose grease were selected according to complex systems of correspondence that linked different plants with different aspects of health and protection. Sage was used for wisdom and clear thinking during illness, thyme for courage in facing pain, rosemary for remembrance of better health, and mint for the clarity needed to visualize complete healing. Hot bricks wrapped in cloth served both practical and psychological purposes. The practical benefit was obvious. A brick heated by the fire and wrapped in wool or cloth could provide warmth for hours when placed at the foot of a bed or held against the body. But the ritual surrounding the preparation and use of these heated bricks revealed deeper beliefs about the nature of warmth itself. The bricks were often inscribed with symbols or words before being heated, transforming them from simple objects into talismans. Some people carved their initials into the clay, believing that the warmth would be more effective if it was personally claimed. Others drew simple symbols, crosses for protection, spirals for continuity, or geometric patterns that were supposed to trap heat and prevent it from escaping too quickly. The most elaborate brick preparations involved the creation of permanent inscriptions that would be renewed and deepened with each heating. Families would develop signature symbols that represented their particular needs and hopes, patterns that incorporated family initials, birth dates, or symbols representing deceased relatives who were believed to provide ongoing protection for the living members of the household. The selection of bricks for heating was never arbitrary. Clay bricks were preferred over stone because clay was believed to hold heat more intimately, absorbing not just the physical energy of the fire, but some of its spiritual essence as well. Bricks that had been used in the construction of churches or other sacred buildings were considered especially powerful, capable of providing not just physical warmth, but spiritual comfort. The cloth used to wrap these heated bricks was chosen with equal care. Wool from particular animals was preferred, especially wool from sheep that had survived harsh winters themselves. The wrapping was done in specific patterns. Some people insisted on wrapping clockwise to draw warmth in, others wrapped counterclockwise to keep cold out. The finished bundle was often blessed or spoken to before use, creating a relationship between the person and their source of warmth. The most precious wrapping cloths were those that had been worn by family members during significant moments, christening gowns, wedding garments, or clothes worn during important family celebrations. These cloths were believed to carry accumulated happiness and good fortune that would enhance the warming properties of the heated brick. These heated brick rituals reveal how Victorian people understood warmth as something that could be cultivated, stored, and directed through proper technique and intention. The act of preparing a heated brick became a meditation on comfort, a way of taking control in circumstances where control was often impossible. The timing of brick heating was often coordinated with other household activities to maximize both practical efficiency and spiritual power. Bricks would be heated during family prayers, absorbing not just the physical energy of the fire, but the spiritual energy of collective hope and determination. They would be removed from the fire during moments of particular family harmony, when the household's combined positive energy was believed to be at its strongest. Some families developed elaborate rotation systems for their heated bricks, ensuring that each family member had access to fresh warmth throughout the night. These systems often resembled complex dances, with family members moving quietly through the house in predetermined patterns, sharing warmth and maintaining the sacred fires that made their survival possible. Gin, that ubiquitous spirit of the Victorian poor, played a central role in winter survival strategies that blended practical warming with ritualistic consumption. The belief that alcohol could provide internal heat was not entirely wrong. Alcohol does create a temporary sensation of warmth as it dilates blood vessels near the skin. But the cultural practices surrounding gin consumption during winter months revealed much deeper beliefs about the relationship between spirits and survival. Gin was often mixed with hot water and consumed in specific ways designed to maximize both its warming effect and its spiritual protection. Some people insisted on adding particular herbs: rosemary for remembrance of warmer days, thyme for courage, mint for clarity of thought during the dark winter months. These herbal additions were believed to enhance gin's natural warming properties while providing additional protection against winter's psychological as well as physical effects. The preparation of medicinal gin became a household art that involved precise attention to proportions, timing, and intent. The herbs used in these preparations had to be gathered or purchased according to specific guidelines. Some had to be collected during particular phases of the moon. Others required blessing by specific types of people before they could be used safely. The water mixed with gin was never ordinary. It had to be drawn from particular sources at particular times, often from wells or springs that were believed to possess special properties. Some households maintained relationships with water carriers who specialized in providing water from sources known for their healing or protective qualities. The timing of gin consumption was also carefully regulated. Many people reserved their small rations of gin for the coldest part of the night, creating a ritual that marked the deepest point of winter darkness. They would sit beside their small fires, holding their cups of warm gin and herbs, and speak quietly about spring, not as a distant hope, but as a certainty that could be summoned through proper intention and ritual observance. These gin ceremonies often involved the entire household, with each member contributing something to the preparation and consumption ritual. Children might be allowed small tastes of the herbal mixtures, usually with most of the alcohol removed, participating in the family's collective effort to maintain warmth and hope through the darkest months. The cups used for ceremonial gin consumption were often specially designated for this purpose, chosen for their ability to retain heat or for their symbolic significance to the family. Some households used cups that had belonged to deceased relatives, believing that the spirits of the dead would add their protection to the warming properties of the drink. The most elaborate gin rituals involved group consumption among neighbors, with families sharing their precious supplies and their particular herbal knowledge. These gatherings served both practical and social purposes, conserving individual family supplies while strengthening community bonds that were essential for collective survival. The most mysterious aspect of Victorian winter survival involved practices that seemed to blur the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds. People reported strange phenomena during the coldest months: unusual sounds in the night, shadows that moved independently of their sources, sensations of being watched or accompanied by invisible presences. Some of these experiences were undoubtedly the result of malnutrition, exhaustion, and the psychological stress of prolonged cold exposure. But others seemed to represent genuine encounters with something beyond ordinary explanation. Families would report that their small fires burned differently during certain nights, with flames that danced in patterns that seemed almost like communication. They would hear footsteps in rooms where no one was walking, or catch glimpses of figures that disappeared when looked at directly. The most commonly reported phenomenon was the sensation of additional warmth appearing in rooms where no new heat source had been introduced. Families would wake to find their living spaces noticeably warmer than expected, with no apparent explanation for the temperature increase. These incidents were usually interpreted as visits from protective spirits, deceased relatives returning to help their living family members survive another winter night. These experiences led to the development of protective practices that combined Christian prayer with much older traditions. People would place circles of salt around their sleeping areas, believing that salt could prevent harmful spirits from approaching during vulnerable sleep hours. They would hang specific combinations of dried herbs above doorways, not just for their pleasant scent, but because certain plants were believed to repel entities that fed on human warmth and vitality. The salt used for protective circles had to be blessed before use, often by having it present during family prayers or by mixing it with water that had been used to wash religious artifacts. Some families maintained special supplies of protective salt that was renewed annually, replaced with fresh salt that had been blessed during important religious holidays. The herbs used for spiritual protection were selected according to ancient systems of correspondence that linked different plants with different types of protective power. Rowan berries were hung to prevent malevolent spirits from entering the home, while bay leaves were used to maintain clarity of thought and prevent confusion during supernatural encounters. Elderflowers were believed to attract beneficial spirits, while iron filings were scattered near doorways to repel harmful entities. The practice of sealing cracks with blessed materials went beyond simple weatherproofing. While newspapers and cloth were indeed used to block drafts, many families insisted on adding blessed items to these makeshift repairs. Small pieces of palm from Palm Sunday, fragments of blessed candles, or bits of cloth that had been touched by religious relics were incorporated into the physical barriers against cold air. These blessed materials were believed to create a double barrier, one against the physical intrusion of cold air, and another against the spiritual forces that were thought to ride the winter winds. The act of sealing a crack became a ritual that addressed both practical and mystical concerns, creating living spaces that were protected on multiple levels. The most elaborate protective systems involved the creation of spiritual maps of the household, with family members identifying areas where supernatural activity was most likely to occur and concentrating their protective efforts in these vulnerable zones. These maps were often drawn on paper and hidden in walls or under floorboards, serving as permanent protective blueprints that would guard the household even when its human inhabitants were asleep or absent. Archaeological investigations of Victorian-era homes have revealed unusual objects hidden in walls, under floorboards, and in the spaces between rooms. Small cloth dolls, sometimes filled with herbs and personal items like hair or nail clippings, were secreted in places where they would be hidden but could still influence the household's well-being. Iron nails were driven into wooden beams in patterns that seemed to follow no practical construction purpose but resembled protective symbols from much older traditions. Most intriguing are the small glass bottles that have been found sealed in walls, containing mixtures of substances that include everything from holy water and salt to more unusual ingredients like mercury, small amounts of human blood, and powdered substances that remain unidentified. These bottles seem to have been placed in walls during construction or renovation, suggesting that they were intended as permanent protective features rather than temporary measures. The contents of these bottles reveal a fascinating blend of Christian symbolism, folk magic, and practical chemistry. Some contain combinations that would indeed have preserved organic materials, preventing decay and maintaining their protective properties over time. Others include substances that would have created slow chemical reactions, perhaps producing small amounts of heat or particular odors that were believed to repel harmful influences. The placement of these protective bottles followed specific architectural principles that suggest sophisticated understanding of how houses function as complete systems. Bottles were often positioned at the corners of rooms, near doorways, or in spaces where different structural elements met, creating protective networks that extended throughout the entire building. Some of the most mysterious bottles contain layers of different substances, arranged in patterns that suggest they were intended to provide protection that would change over time. As chemical reactions slowly altered the contents, different protective properties would become active, creating dynamic systems of spiritual defense that evolved to meet changing seasonal needs. The most elaborate hidden protections involved the creation of protective chambers within walls, small spaces that contained complex arrangements of objects designed to influence the spiritual atmosphere of the entire house. These chambers might contain religious artifacts, personal items from family members, herbs selected for their protective properties, and small amounts of materials believed to possess particular spiritual significance. The most mysterious discoveries are the small metal objects, often copper or lead, that have been found arranged in precise geometric patterns within the walls of Victorian homes. These objects appear to have been placed deliberately, following mathematical principles that suggest knowledge of acoustic or electromagnetic properties that weren't officially understood until much later. Some researchers have speculated that these metal arrangements were intended to influence air circulation within houses, creating subtle currents that would distribute heat more efficiently or reduce drafts in specific areas. Others believe they were designed to affect sound transmission, perhaps muffling the sounds of winter storms or amplifying the warming sounds of crackling fires. The precision of these metal installations suggests that they were created by people who possessed sophisticated understanding of how physical forces operate within enclosed spaces. The patterns often incorporate mathematical relationships that wouldn't be formally recognized by mainstream science for decades after these installations were created. The winter fog that regularly blanketed Victorian London became the subject of particularly intense folklore and protective ritual. People spoke of death fogs, particular types of mist that were believed to carry more than just cold and dampness. These fogs were thought to drain vitality from anyone who breathed them, leaving people more susceptible to illness and spiritual attack. Protection against death fogs involved elaborate breathing rituals. People would cover their mouths and noses with cloth that had been blessed or treated with particular substances. Some used cloth soaked in vinegar, believing that the sharp scent would protect their lungs from harmful vapors. Others preferred cloth treated with oils from specific plants, eucalyptus when it was available, or, more commonly, the oils from whatever aromatic herbs they could obtain. The most sophisticated fog protection involved the creation of household atmospheres that would repel harmful mist before it could enter living spaces. Families would burn specific combinations of herbs and woods, creating smoke that was believed to neutralize the dangerous properties of incoming fog. These protective fires required constant attention, with family members taking turns to maintain the proper balance of smoke and flame. The practice of group breathing during foggy weather created community rituals that served both practical and social purposes. Families and neighbors would gather in the warmest available space and practice synchronized breathing exercises, inhaling and exhaling in patterns that were believed to strengthen their collective resistance to the fog's harmful effects. These breathing rituals were often accompanied by quiet chanting or singing, creating sound vibrations that people believed could dispel harmful vapors and strengthen protective barriers. The combination of controlled breathing, vocal vibration, and group solidarity provided genuine psychological benefits that may have helped people maintain their physical health during particularly challenging weather conditions. The most elaborate community fog rituals involved entire neighborhoods working together to create protective barriers around their area. Groups of people would position themselves at the boundaries of their community, burning protective fires and maintaining vocal chants designed to prevent dangerous fog from settling in their vicinity. These community rituals revealed sophisticated understanding of group psychology and the power of collective action to maintain morale during crisis situations. Even when the protective measures had no direct physical effect on weather conditions, they created strong social bonds and shared sense of purpose that helped communities survive periods when individual survival might have been impossible. The tradition of winter storytelling served functions that went beyond simple entertainment. Stories told during the coldest months were specifically chosen for their warming properties, tales of heroes who overcame impossible odds, accounts of magical fires that never burned out, descriptions of lands where winter never came and people lived in eternal spring. These stories were told with particular attention to their warming imagery. Storytellers would linger over descriptions of glowing hearths, steaming bowls of food, and characters wrapped in furs or magical garments that provided perfect protection against any cold. The act of listening to these stories was believed to warm the body from within, creating internal heat through the power of imagination. The most skilled winter storytellers developed elaborate techniques for making their narratives as physically warming as possible. They would use hand gestures that mimicked the actions of building fires or wrapping oneself in warm clothing. They would modulate their voices to create the sounds of crackling flames or bubbling stews, using vocal techniques that created physical sensations of warmth in their listeners. Children were taught to visualize themselves as the heroes of these warm stories, imagining that they possessed magical protection against cold or could summon fire through willpower alone. These visualization exercises served as early forms of mental training that helped young people develop psychological resilience against hardship. The stories themselves often incorporated practical survival information disguised as magical techniques. Tales of heroes who survived impossible winters would include detailed descriptions of actual survival techniques, how to find fuel, how to construct effective shelters, how to maintain hope during the darkest periods. Children who listened to these stories absorbed practical knowledge along with entertainment and psychological comfort. The most precious winter stories were those that had been passed down through family lines, carrying not just entertainment value, but the accumulated wisdom of generations who had faced similar challenges. These family stories were often modified with each telling, with new details added that reflected current circumstances or recent discoveries about effective survival techniques. The bells of London's churches played a special role in winter protection rituals. People believed that certain combinations of bell tones could break up harmful fog, dispel malevolent spirits, and even influence weather patterns. During the worst winter weather, neighborhoods would organize group prayers timed to coincide with specific bell patterns, creating community rituals that combined Christian worship with much older practices of weather magic. The sound of bells was thought to create protective barriers around communities, sonic shields that prevented harmful influences from settling in particular areas. People would time their most vulnerable activities, going to sleep, preparing food, caring for the sick, to coincide with periods when church bells were ringing, believing that they were safer when surrounded by these protective sounds. The most sophisticated bell magic involved understanding the specific protective properties of different bell tones and rhythms. Church bells that rang at particular intervals were believed to provide different types of protection. Some patterns were considered especially effective against supernatural threats, while others were thought to influence weather patterns or strengthen community bonds. Families would teach their children to recognize the protective properties of different bell sequences, creating an oral tradition that linked spiritual practice with practical survival knowledge. Children who understood bell magic could time their outdoor activities to coincide with periods of maximum protection, reducing their exposure to both physical and spiritual dangers. The community coordination required for effective bell magic revealed sophisticated understanding of how group activities could create effects that no individual could achieve alone. Neighborhoods would organize their winter routines around church bell schedules, creating community rhythms that strengthened social bonds while providing psychological comfort during the most challenging months. As we drift through these mysteries and practices, we begin to understand that Victorian people lived in a world where the boundary between the material and spiritual was much more permeable than our modern minds might easily accept. Their survival strategies addressed not just the physical challenge of staying warm, but the psychological and spiritual challenges of maintaining hope, community, and identity during months of hardship. These practices reveal a sophisticated understanding of the connections between mind and body, between individual and community, between practical action and symbolic meaning. Whether or not the protective rituals actually influenced physical reality, they clearly provided psychological benefits that helped people endure circumstances that might otherwise have broken their spirits. The integration of practical and mystical approaches to winter survival reflected a worldview that recognized multiple layers of reality operating simultaneously. Physical cold was addressed through physical measures, clothing, fuel, shelter, but the spiritual and psychological effects of prolonged hardship required different types of intervention. The community aspects of these survival practices reveal understanding that individual survival was often impossible without group support and shared resources. The rituals that brought neighbors together served practical functions, sharing fuel, food, and warmth, while also maintaining the social bonds that made collective survival possible. The quiet wisdom embedded in these traditions speaks to fundamental human needs that transcend any particular time period or cultural context. The need to feel some control over hostile circumstances, the need to maintain connection with community during isolating times, the need to find meaning and purpose even in the midst of survival-level struggle. These are universal experiences that the Victorian poor addressed through creative combinations of practical action and ritual observance. The sophistication of these survival systems suggests that they evolved over many generations, with each winter season providing opportunities to test, refine, and improve techniques for maintaining physical, psychological, and spiritual health during periods of extreme hardship. The Victorian poor were not simply victims of circumstances beyond their control, but active creators of complex cultural systems that enabled survival under conditions that might have destroyed less organized communities. The mystical elements of these practices served essential functions that purely practical approaches could not address. The need for hope, the need for meaning, the need for connection with forces larger than individual human vulnerability. These psychological and spiritual requirements were as crucial for survival as adequate food and fuel. Modern readers might be tempted to dismiss the supernatural aspects of these practices as mere superstition, but doing so would miss the deeper wisdom they represent. These rituals provided genuine psychological benefits that translated into improved physical health and increased likelihood of survival. The placebo effect, the power of positive thinking, the health benefits of strong community bonds, all of these scientifically recognized phenomena were integrated into Victorian survival practices in ways that maximized their practical benefits. The Victorian poor understood that surviving winter required more than just staying physically warm. It required maintaining psychological resilience, spiritual hope, and community connection. Their practices addressed all of these needs simultaneously, creating integrated systems of support that enabled survival under conditions that would challenge any human community. As we consider these practices from our modern perspective, we might recognize that our contemporary approaches to crisis survival could benefit from similar integration of practical and psychological strategies. The Victorian poor developed their survival techniques under conditions of genuine desperation, and their solutions reflect hard-won wisdom about what human beings actually need to endure extreme hardship. The mystical and practical elements of these traditions were not separate systems but integrated approaches that recognized the complex nature of human survival needs. Physical warmth, psychological comfort, spiritual hope, and community connection were all understood as essential elements that had to be maintained simultaneously for effective survival. The enduring power of these practices lies not in their supernatural claims, but in their recognition that human survival is always more than a purely physical challenge. The Victorian poor understood that maintaining hope, meaning, and community connection during crisis periods was not a luxury, but a necessity, and they developed sophisticated techniques for ensuring that these psychological and social resources remained available even during the most challenging circumstances. Their wisdom speaks across time to anyone who faces overwhelming challenges, reminding us that survival is not just about maintaining physical life, but about preserving the psychological, spiritual, and social resources that make life worth living. In their quiet determination to find meaning and maintain hope in the face of desperate circumstances, the Victorian poor demonstrated a form of courage that transcends any particular historical period and speaks to the fundamental resilience of the human spirit. As our journey through Victorian winter draws toward its quiet close, let us now drift into a different world entirely, one separated from everything we've experienced so far by little more than the accident of birth and the weight of inherited coin. Here, in the warm drawing rooms and heated conservatories of the wealthy, winter was not a battle to be survived, but a season to be enjoyed, a backdrop for comfort rather than a test of endurance. Picture yourself now in an entirely different role, standing not in a cramped tenement room or a servant's cold corridor, but in the marble-floored entrance hall of a great house in Belgravia or Mayfair. The contrast is so complete, it might seem like stepping into another world entirely, which, in many ways, it was. The very architecture speaks of abundance and security, soaring ceilings adorned with intricate plasterwork, walls lined with portraits of ancestors who never knew want, and floors of polished stone that retain warmth from the elaborate heating systems hidden beneath. The warmth hits you immediately, a wall of heated air that seems almost shocking after our long journey through cold spaces and colder lives. This warmth is not the small, precious circle of heat generated by a single candle or a carefully hoarded piece of coal. This is comprehensive, enveloping warmth that fills every corner of every room, warmth that never requires thought or conservation because it is simply always there, as constant and reliable as breathing. The heating systems that generated this comfort were marvels of Victorian engineering, networks of pipes carrying hot water or steam throughout the house, supplemented by fireplaces in every room and supplementary braziers that could be moved wherever additional warmth might be desired. The very quality of air in these spaces was different. While the poor breathed air thick with coal smoke, dampness, and the exhalations of too many people crowded into too small spaces, the atmosphere in wealthy homes was carefully managed. Servants opened windows at strategic times to ensure proper ventilation, while still maintaining comfortable temperatures. The air itself seemed to carry the sense of luxury: beeswax candles, fine soaps, fresh flowers that were somehow available even in the depths of winter, and the subtle fragrances of well-maintained fabrics and polished wood. The rhythm of days in these grand houses was shaped not by the desperate search for warmth, but by the luxury of choosing among different types and degrees of comfort. Should one take breakfast in the morning room, where the winter sun streamed through large windows onto polished tables laden with silver serving dishes, or perhaps in the smaller, cozier breakfast parlor, where a fire had been burning since before dawn and the temperature was perfectly controlled by servants who understood exactly how much fuel to add and when. The decision itself was a luxury, having multiple warm spaces from which to choose, each offering its own particular advantages and ambiance. These choices extended beyond simple room selection. The wealthy could decide whether to spend their morning in the conservatory, where exotic plants thrived in artificially maintained tropical conditions, or in the library, where leather-bound volumes were housed at temperatures carefully controlled to preserve both books and human comfort. They might choose to write correspondence in the small study overlooking the garden, where a coal fire burned continuously and writing materials were kept at the perfect temperature to prevent ink from thickening in the cold. These were the kinds of decisions that filled the days of the wealthy during Victorian winters, not whether they would be warm, but how warm they preferred to be, not whether they would eat, but which of several elaborate meals they would choose to attend, not whether they would have light, but whether they preferred the golden glow of gaslight or the dancing shadows cast by carefully tended fireplaces. Each choice was backed by an infrastructure of comfort that remained invisible to those who benefited from it but required constant labor from those who maintained it. Every room in these houses had its own fireplace, and every fireplace was attended by servants whose primary responsibility was maintaining perfect temperature and ambience. The fires were not the small, carefully rationed affairs we've encountered in our earlier journeys, but grand displays of abundance. Logs of the finest hardwood burning in grates, designed as much for beauty as for function, casting light and warmth into rooms filled with furniture that had been chosen specifically for comfort. The very coal and wood used in these homes was of superior quality, selected for clean burning and consistent heat production. The fireplace accessories themselves told stories of luxury and attention to detail. Brass andirons, intricate fire screens, and elegant sets of poker, tongs, and bellows were crafted by skilled artisans and maintained to gleaming perfection. Coal scuttles were works of art, made from brass or copper, and kept filled with the finest Welsh coal. Kindling was prepared to precise specifications, ensuring that fires could be lit quickly and maintained efficiently. Even the ashes were removed with ceremony, collected in special containers, and disposed of by servants who took pride in maintaining the pristine appearance of each fireplace. The morning routine in these houses began not with the shock of cold air and the struggle to find stiff clothing, but with gentle awakening in rooms that had been kept at perfect sleeping temperature throughout the night. Personal servants appeared at precisely the right moment with hot water for washing, clothes that had been warmed by the fire, and the news that breakfast was ready whenever their employers chose to appear. The very concept of waking up warm was so foreign to the experience of most Victorians that it represented a fundamental difference in the quality of human experience. The bedrooms themselves were sanctuaries of comfort. Heavy curtains blocked drafts and retained heat, while thick carpets cushioned feet from cold floors. Beds were equipped with multiple layers of fine linens, down comforters, and wool blankets, creating cocoons of warmth that made the transition from sleep to waking a gentle process rather than a shocking plunge into cold reality. Hot water bottles filled by servants and placed strategically throughout the bed provided additional warmth that lasted through the night. Imagine yourself waking in such circumstances, your body resting on mattresses filled with the finest down, your room heated by a fire that someone else has maintained while you slept, your clothes laid out in perfect order and warmed to exactly the right temperature. The contrast with everything we've experienced together is almost beyond comprehension. It's as if we've traveled not just from one social class to another, but from one species of human experience to an entirely different form of life. The rituals of washing and dressing in wealthy households were elaborate affairs that celebrated comfort and luxury. Hot water was brought in decorated pitchers and poured into elegant basins, creating clouds of steam that warmed both air and spirits. Soaps were imported luxuries, scented with exotic oils and crafted to produce rich lathers. Towels were thick, soft, and pre-warmed by fires in the servants' quarters. The very process of personal hygiene, which for the poor was often a painful ordeal conducted in icy water with rough soap and thin towels, became for the wealthy a daily celebration of physical comfort. The food available to the wealthy during winter months revealed perhaps the starkest contrast with the experiences of the poor. While Hannah Culwick and her contemporaries stretched thin soup and stale bread through long, cold days, the dining rooms of the elite were filled with abundance that bordered on the spectacular. The sheer variety of food available was staggering: preserved meats from across the British Empire, exotic spices that had travelled thousands of miles, fresh vegetables grown in heated greenhouses, and dairy products of a quality and richness that most people never tasted. Winter meals in great houses were elaborate affairs that could last for hours and involved dozens of different dishes. The breakfast table alone might offer fresh eggs prepared in multiple ways, Several varieties of fresh bread and pastries, preserved fruits that had been carefully stored from summer harvests, fresh dairy products, and meats that had been specially cured or imported from distant places where the climate was more favorable. Jams and jellies, made from the finest fruits and stored in special pantries, provided bright flavors that countered the drabness of winter. Fresh butter, cream, and milk were available daily, delivered from farms that specialized in serving wealthy households. But it was the warmth of this food that provided the most striking contrast with our earlier experiences. Everything was served at perfect temperature, kept warm by silver serving dishes designed specifically for that purpose, many of which incorporated heated water chambers or warming candles. Hot soups arrived steaming, their surfaces barely disturbed by the brief journey from kitchen to table. Fresh bread came to the table still warm from the oven, releasing aromatic vapors that filled the dining room. Beverages were heated to precise temperatures that maximized both flavor and comfort. Coffee kept at the perfect drinking temperature. Tea served with elaborate rituals that celebrated its warmth, and chocolate drinks so rich and warm they seemed like liquid comfort. The very act of eating became a form of warming ritual, but one based on abundance rather than scarcity. Family members and guests would linger over meals, not because they were trying to make meager portions last longer, but because the pleasure of warm food in warm rooms was something to be savored and extended. Conversations flowed as freely as the heated wine and mulled cider, creating social experiences that were themselves a form of luxury. The dining room became a stage for displays of wealth and refinement, where the quality of food, the temperature of service, and the elegance of presentation all combined to create experiences that affirmed the diner's social position. The evening meals were even more elaborate, featuring multiple courses that could include roasted meats cooked to perfection in massive ovens, rich gravies that had simmered for hours, winter vegetables prepared with butter and cream and exotic seasonings, and desserts that required hours of preparation by kitchen staff working in rooms that were kept warm specifically to ensure the success of complex cooking processes. These meals were social events that could last well into the night, with each course providing not just nourishment, but entertainment, conversation topics, and opportunities for the display of social graces. The kitchens themselves, hidden away in the basement levels of these grand houses, were marvels of heated efficiency that rivaled the most sophisticated restaurants of the era. Multiple fires burned constantly, providing not just cooking heat, but warmth for the staff who worked there. These rooms were often among the warmest in the house, filled with the steam from cooking processes and heated by ovens that required constant attention and fuel. The kitchen fires were never allowed to die completely, maintained around the clock by kitchen servants who took turns stoking and tending the various heating sources. The kitchen infrastructure was a testament to Victorian engineering and organizational skill. Vast ranges with multiple ovens and cooking surfaces, specialized areas for different types of food preparation, storage systems designed to keep ingredients at optimal temperatures, and ventilation systems that managed heat and smoke without allowing cold air to enter. Separate preparation areas for pastries, meats, vegetables, and sauces were each maintained at temperatures appropriate to their specific functions. Yet even in these warm kitchens, there was a hierarchy of comfort that reflected the broader social order. The cook, who held a position of considerable authority and commanded respect throughout the household staff, worked closest to the main cooking fires and enjoyed the most consistent warmth. This position was both practical and symbolic. The cook's proximity to the primary heat sources reflected their importance in the household hierarchy. Kitchen maids and scullery servants worked at the edges of these heated spaces, closer to cold storage areas and wash basins that remained chilly despite the surrounding warmth. Their tasks often involved moving between warm and cold areas, carrying ingredients from cold storage to warm preparation areas, washing dishes in water that cooled quickly in the winter air. The parlors and drawing rooms where the wealthy spent their leisure hours were designed as showcases of comfort that demonstrated both aesthetic sensibility and practical luxury. Heavy velvet curtains, often in rich jewel tones, blocked drafts and helped retain heat while creating intimate atmospheres that encouraged conversation and relaxation. These curtains were themselves works of art, featuring elaborate patterns and crafted from materials that cost more than most families earned in months. Thick carpets, often imported from exotic locations, covered floors that might otherwise conduct cold from the stone or wood beneath, while also providing visual warmth through their rich colors and intricate patterns. Furniture was upholstered in materials chosen specifically for their ability to retain and reflect warmth. Rich fabrics like velvet, brocade, and fine wool that felt soft and welcoming to the touch while also providing insulation from any residual cold. Chairs and sofas were designed with high backs and sides that could block drafts while creating cozy seating areas. Even the arrangement of furniture followed principles of thermal comfort, with seating positioned to take maximum advantage of fireplace warmth while avoiding cold drafts from windows or doorways. These rooms were arranged to maximize the pleasure of winter evenings, creating environments that celebrated both physical comfort and aesthetic refinement. Comfortable chairs and sofas were positioned to take advantage of fireplace warmth while still allowing for conversation and various forms of entertainment. Small tables, often beautifully crafted and inlaid with exotic woods or decorated with intricate metalwork, held books, games, and refreshments, creating intimate spaces where people could pursue leisure activities while remaining perfectly warm and comfortable. The lighting in these rooms was carefully orchestrated to create atmospheres that enhanced both comfort and beauty. Gas fixtures, still a relatively new technology, provided steady, controllable light that could be adjusted to create different moods throughout the evening. Candles, though no longer necessary for basic illumination, were used for their aesthetic and atmospheric qualities, their warm glow contributing to the overall sense of luxury and comfort. Oil lamps with painted glass shades cast colored light that enhanced the richness of fabrics and the warmth of wood surfaces. The wealthy developed elaborate social rituals around the enjoyment of winter comfort that transformed what had been basic survival activities into complex cultural practices. Afternoon tea became an art form that celebrated warmth and abundance. Delicate china filled with steaming beverages, plates of warm pastries, and cakes that had been prepared throughout the morning, and conversations that could extend for hours because no one needed to hurry back to work or worry about conserving fuel for heat. The very act of sitting still for extended periods, enjoying warm beverages and conversation, was a luxury that most Victorians could not afford. These tea ceremonies involved elaborate preparation and presentation rituals. Special tables were set with fine linens and the best china. Silver tea services were polished to perfection, and multiple varieties of tea were available to suit different tastes and times of day. The food accompanying tea was prepared with the same attention to temperature and presentation as formal meals: warm scones with butter and jam, delicate sandwiches with crusts removed, and cakes and pastries that demonstrated the skill of the household's cooking staff. Evening gatherings in these warm parlors often included activities that would have been impossible in the cold rooms where most of Victorian society lived. Musical performances on instruments that required warm fingers and comfortable seating became elaborate entertainment events. Pianos, which were sensitive to temperature changes and required consistent warmth to maintain proper tuning, were common features of wealthy drawing rooms. The ability to play music in comfort without fingers stiffened by cold or instruments damaged by temperature fluctuations was yet another privilege that separated the wealthy from their contemporaries. Card games that could last deep into the night became social institutions, with elaborate rules and traditions that developed around the comfort and leisure that wealth provided. Players could concentrate on strategy and social interaction rather than physical discomfort, leading to more sophisticated games and more complex social dynamics. Reading sessions where people could sit still for hours without the need to move constantly to generate warmth became opportunities for intellectual and cultural development that were simply impossible for those who lived in cold conditions. The wealthy also developed winter sports and activities that celebrated their ability to venture into cold conditions and then return quickly to warmth and comfort. Ice skating parties, sleigh rides, and outdoor winter gatherings were possible because participants knew they could retreat to heated spaces whenever they chose. These activities became social events that demonstrated both physical vigor and social status, the ability to enjoy winter weather because one was not dependent on it for survival. Yet, even in the midst of this comfort, there were subtle reminders of the cold world that existed beyond the heated walls. Windows, no matter how well fitted with the best available technology, still conducted cold from outside, creating small drafts that required strategic placement of furniture and careful attention to seating arrangements. The finest homes employed specialized craftsmen to ensure the tightest possible fit for windows and doors. But the physics of heat transfer meant that some cold inevitably penetrated even the most luxurious spaces. The sounds of winter storms could still penetrate into these warm spaces, providing a soundtrack of wind and weather that reminded inhabitants of conditions they were fortunate enough to avoid. These sounds created complex emotional responses. Some residents found them cozy and comforting, a reminder of their security and warmth, while others felt guilty or anxious about those who were exposed to the storms they could only hear from safety. The wealthy were not entirely insulated from awareness of the suffering that surrounded their comfort, though their responses to this awareness varied greatly. The contrast was often most visible when they traveled, venturing out in heated carriages that provided mobile comfort but could not entirely shield them from glimpses of the cold world through which they moved. These journeys created moments of cognitive dissonance as passengers moved between environments of complete comfort and visible scenes of hardship. These carriages were marvels of portable warmth that represented the cutting edge of transportation technology. They were fitted with heated bricks that had been warmed in kitchen fires and wrapped in flannel, thick blankets made from the finest wool and fur, and sometimes even small portable braziers that could provide heat during long journeys without creating dangerous fumes inside the enclosed space. The interiors were upholstered with the finest materials available and designed to retain warmth while blocking drafts through sophisticated ventilation systems that allowed fresh air without cold air. Wealthy travelers could move from heated house to heated carriage to heated destination without ever experiencing the bite of winter air that was the constant companion of everyone else in their society. This ability to exist in a network of warm spaces created a parallel infrastructure that allowed the wealthy to live almost entirely separate lives from their contemporaries, experiencing winter as a series of comfortable indoor experiences connected by brief, cushioned journeys rather than as a season of hardship and endurance. Yet from the windows of these comfortable carriages, they could see the reality of winter for the majority of their contemporaries. People huddled in doorways, children without adequate clothing, running errands in the cold, the smoke rising from tenements where families struggled to generate enough heat to survive. These glimpses created a complex emotional landscape for some members of the elite, a mixture of gratitude for their own comfort and guilt about the suffering they witnessed, though others seemed able to look through rather than at the scenes of hardship outside their windows. The gentlemen's clubs of London provided perhaps the ultimate expression of winter comfort for wealthy men, creating environments that represented the pinnacle of Victorian heating technology and social luxury. These institutions were designed as havens of warmth, luxury, and masculine companionship, places where members could escape not just the cold of winter, but any reminder of the less comfortable world beyond their heated walls. The clubs represented a social innovation that combined the comforts of home with the sophistication of public institutions. The clubs maintained perfect temperatures through elaborate heating systems that represented the cutting edge of Victorian technology. Multiple fireplaces, early central heating systems using steam or hot water, and careful attention to insulation created environments that were consistently warm and comfortable, regardless of conditions outside. The heating systems were designed with redundancy in mind. If one system failed, others could maintain comfort while repairs were made. Members could spend entire days in these spaces, moving from warm dining room to heated library to comfortable sitting areas without ever experiencing a moment of chill. The architecture of these clubs was specifically designed to maximize both comfort and social interaction. High ceilings allowed warm air to circulate properly, while careful window placement provided natural light without creating cold drafts. Thick walls provided excellent insulation, while elaborate ventilation systems ensured fresh air without compromising warmth. The result was an environment that felt both grand and intimate, allowing for large social gatherings and private conversations with equal comfort. The libraries in these clubs were particularly notable for their combination of intellectual luxury and physical comfort. Thousands of books were housed in rooms kept at ideal temperatures for both human comfort and book preservation, with humidity levels carefully controlled to prevent damage to valuable collection. Comfortable leather chairs, often custom-made by the finest furniture craftsmen, were positioned near fireplaces and windows to provide perfect reading conditions, while small tables held refreshments that were kept at ideal temperatures by attentive staff. These libraries became centers of intellectual and social life, where members could pursue reading, writing, and conversation in conditions of perfect comfort. The ability to sit still for hours, completely comfortable, allowed for deeper engagement with books and ideas than was possible in less comfortable environments. Many important political, business, and cultural decisions were made in these warm, quiet spaces where men could think and discuss without physical discomfort. The dining facilities in these clubs rivaled those of the finest restaurants, offering elaborate meals prepared by professional chefs and served in rooms that maintained perfect ambiance through careful attention to heating, lighting, and ventilation. Members could order complex meals at any hour, confident that everything would be prepared and served at optimal temperature and quality. The dining rooms themselves were designed as theaters of comfort and luxury, with elaborate decorations, comfortable seating, and service that anticipated every possible need. Yet even within these bastions of comfort, there were subtle acknowledgments of the cold world beyond. Cloakrooms near entrances were designed to handle the outer garments that members wore when venturing into winter weather. Heavy coats made from the finest materials, fur-lined gloves crafted by specialized artisans, and warm hats that represented the latest in cold weather fashion were carefully stored and maintained by club staff, creating a buffer zone between the perfect comfort within and the harsh reality without. The social dynamics within these heated spaces revealed interesting aspects of how wealth and comfort influenced human behavior and thought. Freed from the constant physical stress of staying warm, members could focus entirely on intellectual pursuits, social relationships, and various forms of entertainment that required leisure and comfort to fully enjoy. The absence of physical discomfort allowed for more sophisticated social interactions and more complex intellectual discussions. Conversations in these warm clubs often turned to topics that revealed both the privileges and the limitations of extreme comfort. Members discussed business ventures that spanned the globe, political developments that affected millions of people, and social issues that shaped the direction of society, but their perspectives were inevitably shaped by their distance from the physical realities that dominated most people's lives. They could debate policies about poverty and social conditions while sitting in perfectly heated rooms, eating elaborate meals, and wearing clothing that cost more than most families earned in a year. This physical separation from hardship created both opportunities and limitations. On one hand, the comfort and leisure that wealth provided allowed for careful thought, extensive reading, and detailed discussion of complex issues. On the other hand, the lack of direct experience with hardship sometimes led to policies and perspectives that seemed disconnected from the realities they were meant to address. The warm comfort of the clubs both enabled sophisticated thinking and potentially limited its connection to broader human experience. Some members of the elite used their comfort as a platform for genuine charitable efforts, organizing relief programs and supporting institutions designed to help the poor survive winter hardships. These efforts were often sincere and sometimes effective, representing the best impulses of Victorian philanthropy. However, they also revealed the vast gulf between the experiences of those who organized charity and those who required it. Charity became a way of acknowledging suffering while maintaining the distance that wealth and comfort provided. The seasonal social calendar of the wealthy was designed around the assumption of perfect comfort and unlimited resources, creating a parallel cultural world that existed alongside but separate from the struggles of the majority. Winter balls and parties were elaborate affairs that celebrated luxury and abundance, featuring heated ballrooms that could accommodate hundreds of guests, elaborate meals that required days of preparation, and entertainment that could last until dawn. These events required enormous amounts of fuel, food, and labor to maintain the levels of warmth and luxury that guests expected, representing consumption levels that were almost unimaginable to most Victorians. The preparation for these social events revealed the infrastructure of comfort that supported elite Victorian life. Teams of servants worked for days to prepare houses for entertaining, ensuring that every room would be perfectly heated, every meal would be served at ideal temperature, and every guest would experience the kind of seamless comfort that made their wealth and status visible. The logistics of maintaining warmth and luxury for large numbers of people required sophisticated planning and substantial resources. Yet there were also moments of vulnerability, even within these circles of comfort and privilege, that reminded the wealthy that their security, while substantial, was not absolute. Extreme weather could sometimes challenge even the most elaborate heating systems, creating brief experiences of cold that reminded them of their dependence on the technology and labor that maintained their comfortable lives. When heating systems failed, even temporarily, the wealthy experienced a taste of the vulnerability that defined most people's daily existence. Illness could also penetrate the barriers of wealth and comfort with democratic impartiality. Influenza and other diseases showed little respect for social class, and even the finest heated homes could not entirely prevent the spread of infection. When sickness struck wealthy households, it often revealed how much their comfort depended on the health and availability of the servants who maintained their heating systems, prepared their food, and attended to their daily needs. The complex systems that generated comfort required constant human attention and care. The seasonal rhythms of elite life were shaped by the luxury of choice rather than the demands of survival, creating annual patterns that celebrated comfort and leisure. Wealthy families could choose to spend winter months in their London houses, enjoying the social season and the comfort of urban amenities, or they could retreat to country estates where different but equally elaborate forms of comfort awaited them. Some families maintained multiple residences, moving between them according to social obligations, personal preferences, and seasonal considerations. Country houses during winter offered their own forms of luxury, often featuring even more elaborate heating systems and larger fireplaces than their urban counterparts. The rural setting provided opportunities for winter sports and activities that were available only to those with sufficient leisure time and resources. Hunting parties that returned to warm houses for elaborate meals, sleigh rides that ended with hot beverages beside roaring fires, and outdoor activities that were possible only because participants knew they could quickly return to perfect comfort. The country estates also provided opportunities for the wealthy to engage with nature in ways that were mediated by comfort and security. They could enjoy the beauty of winter landscapes from warm windows, venture outdoors in the finest cold weather clothing, and return to heated houses whenever they chose. This relationship with winter weather was fundamentally different from that of rural labourers who worked outdoors by necessity rather than choice. Yet, even in these country retreats, the wealthy could not entirely escape awareness of the broader social reality. Estate workers, tenant farmers, and rural labourers lived in conditions that more closely resembled those we explored in our earlier segments, and the contrast was often visible from the windows of heated manor houses. The juxtaposition of comfort and hardship was sometimes more stark in rural settings than in urban ones, as the physical distance between different social classes was less than the economic distance. Some members of the elite found this contrast troubling, developing complex feelings about their privileges and responsibilities. Others seemed able to ignore or rationalize the disparities, focusing entirely on their own comfort and social obligations. These different responses to privilege created divisions even within wealthy society, as individuals struggled with questions about social responsibility and the moral implications of extreme inequality. The comfort that wealth provided sometimes created moral comfort as well as physical comfort, allowing people to avoid confronting difficult questions about justice and social organization. The children of wealthy families grew up in environments where warmth and comfort were simply assumed, creating expectations and perspectives that shaped their understanding of the world in fundamental ways. They learned to expect that rooms would always be warm, food would always be abundant and perfectly prepared, and clothing would always be comfortable and appropriate for any weather conditions. This childhood experience of consistent comfort created adults who sometimes struggled to understand the experiences of those less fortunate, not from lack of empathy, but from genuine inability to imagine what life might be like without the basic securities they had always taken for granted. The education of wealthy children took place in environments of perfect comfort that allowed for learning and intellectual development that would have been impossible under other conditions. Private tutors worked in warm rooms with adequate light and comfortable furniture, using books and materials that were protected from cold and damp. The children themselves could concentrate on learning without the distractions of physical discomfort, cold, or hunger that affected the majority of their contemporaries. This educational privilege, enabled by physical comfort, created intellectual advantages that compounded over time. Children who could focus entirely on learning, who had access to the best teachers and materials, and who never missed lessons due to cold or illness developed intellectual capabilities that reflected their social advantages. The warm rooms where they studied became launching pads for careers in politics, business, and the professions that would maintain and extend their families' wealth and influence. The psychological distance between the comfortable and the struggling was reinforced by the physical distance that wealth could purchase, the ability to live, work, and socialize entirely within heated, comfortable environments. This separation created two different species of human experience within the same society, with the wealthy living lives that were not just economically different, but phenomenologically different from those of their contemporaries. As we reach the end of our exploration of Victorian winter comfort, we can see how completely different this world was from the cold, difficult reality that shaped most people's lives. The wealthy lived in a parallel universe where winter was a season to be enjoyed rather than endured, where cold was a temporary inconvenience rather than a constant threat, and where warmth was a given rather than a precious commodity to be carefully conserved. Their days were structured around choices about comfort rather than struggles for survival, and their social lives were built around the assumption that physical needs would always be met. Yet this comfort came with its own complexities: the moral weight of privilege, the psychological distance from broader social reality, and the subtle vulnerabilities that even wealth could not entirely eliminate. The heated parlors and comfortable clubs of the Victorian elite were both refugees from the harsh realities of their time and barriers to full understanding of the world beyond their warm walls. The very comfort that protected them from suffering also protected them from full comprehension of the society they inhabited and influenced. The legacy of this winter comfort extended far beyond individual experience, shaping social attitudes, political perspectives, and cultural developments that would influence Victorian society for generations. The ability of the wealthy to exist in warmth and comfort, while the majority struggled with cold and want, created social dynamics that defined the era and continue to influence our understanding of privilege, responsibility, and the relationship between physical comfort and moral obligation. In the end, the warm drawing rooms of the Victorian elite were not just spaces of physical comfort, but laboratories of social and moral complexity, where the implications of extreme inequality played out in the intimate details of daily life. And so, as our quiet journey through Victorian winter draws to its gentle close, let us take a moment to reflect on the distance we've travelled together, not just through the cold streets and warm parlours of 19th century Britain, but through the full spectrum of human experience in the face of winter's ancient challenge. We began in the cramped, frost-touched rooms where ordinary people woke each morning to the shock of cold air and the daily question of survival. We felt the stiffness of clothing that had absorbed the night's chill, experienced the careful choreography required to preserve whatever small warmth could be generated or found. We learned to measure comfort in degrees and minutes, to understand wealth in terms of coal and candles, to appreciate the profound luxury of simply being warm enough to think about something other than being cold. From those cold rooms, we followed Hannah Culwick through her long life of service, watching as she transformed the hardship of endless cold work into a source of personal strength and quiet dignity. Her red, swollen hands became symbols not just of suffering, but of resilience, proof that even in the most constrained circumstances, it remains possible to maintain one's humanity, to create meaning from difficulty, to insist on the value of one's own experience and perspective. We drifted then into the mysterious realm where practical necessity met spiritual hope, exploring the elaborate rituals and protective practices that people developed to shield themselves against more than just physical cold. We discovered that survival required more than adequate shelter and fuel. It demanded community, meaning, and the kind of inner warmth that comes from believing that one's struggle has purpose and that comfort, somewhere and somehow, remains possible. Finally, we stepped into the heated parlors and comfortable clubs of the wealthy, experiencing winter as a season of luxury rather than hardship, of abundance rather than scarcity. We saw how completely different human experience could be when freed from the daily struggle against cold and want, but we also glimpsed the moral complexities and psychological barriers that such privilege could create. The rhythm of our journey has taken us through every level of Victorian society's relationship with winter, revealing not just the obvious differences in material comfort, but the more subtle ways that cold and warmth shaped consciousness, community, and character. We've seen how the absence or presence of physical comfort influenced everything from daily routines to spiritual beliefs, from individual identity to social relationships. Perhaps most striking has been the discovery that warmth itself was never simply a matter of temperature. The cold that penetrated Victorian tenements was more than the absence of heat. It was a presence that shaped how people thought about themselves, their relationships, and their possibilities. Similarly, the warmth that filled elite drawing rooms provided more than physical comfort. It created psychological space for pursuits and perspectives that were simply impossible when survival required constant attention. Yet through all the variations in material circumstance, we've also discovered constants in human nature that transcend any particular time or social class. The need for dignity in the face of hardship, the search for meaning within constraint, the desire for community and connection, the hope for something better. These fundamental aspects of human experience appeared in every setting we visited, from the coldest tenement room to the most luxurious heated parlor. Hannah Colwick's careful diary entries remind us that inner life persists regardless of outer circumstance. The elaborate protective rituals of Victorian folk medicine show us that people will always reach for control and hope, even when rational solutions seem inadequate. The guilty awareness that sometimes troubled wealthy individuals in their comfortable clubs suggests that empathy and moral consciousness can survive even the most privileging circumstances. As we settle deeper into our own warm spaces tonight, perhaps pulling soft blankets a little closer, or adjusting the temperature to our personal preference, we can appreciate these simple comforts with new understanding. The ability to be warm without effort or worry, to have light without rationing, to eat food that's been heated to the perfect temperature, these are not just conveniences, but profound luxuries that would have seemed miraculous to most of the people we've encountered in our journey. The distance between their world and ours is measured not just in years, but in the fundamental transformation of what it means to be warm, to be safe, to be comfortable in winter. We live in a world where heating is so reliable we rarely think about it, where warm clothing is so available we choose based on fashion rather than survival, where the question is never whether we'll be warm enough, but how warm we prefer to be. Yet our Victorian companions have taught us that this comfort, taken for granted, represents the accumulated efforts of countless individuals who struggled with cold, who developed technologies and systems and social arrangements that gradually made winter less threatening. Every warm room we enter exists because people like Hannah Colwick scrubbed floors with cold, raw hands. Every reliable heating system we enjoy was built on the foundation of earlier systems that required constant tending and careful rationing. The warmth that surrounds us as we prepare for sleep carries within it the echo of all those cold Victorian nights, all those careful rituals designed to preserve heat, all those moments of profound gratitude for small comforts. Our comfort has been purchased with their discomfort, built on their innovations, made possible by their endurance. Perhaps this is the most profound gift our Victorian friends can offer us, not just the appreciation of our own comfort, but the understanding that comfort itself is a form of wealth that can be shared, preserved, and passed forward. The warmth we enjoy was created not by individuals working alone, but by communities working together across generations to solve the ancient human challenge of staying warm enough to thrive. The social divisions we explored between the cold rooms of the poor and the heated parlors of the rich remind us that comfort remains unequally distributed even in our own time. While we may no longer face the stark contrasts of Victorian winter, the fundamental question of who has access to comfort and who must struggle for basic security continues to shape our world. But our journey has also shown us that dignity, resilience, and humanity persist regardless of material circumstance. Hannah Colwick's quiet strength, the elaborate community rituals of winter protection, the complex moral awareness of thoughtful, wealthy individuals, all of these remind us that the most important forms of warmth may be the ones that people create for each other through understanding, respect, and shared concern. As you feel yourself growing drowsy in whatever warm space you occupy tonight, let your mind drift back once more through the scenes we've shared. Feel the contrast between the cold that pressed against every Victorian window and the warmth that surrounds you now. Notice the difference between their careful rationing of light and heat and your ability to adjust comfort at will, but also carry forward their quiet lessons about finding meaning in difficulty, about creating dignity within constraint, about the ways that community and ritual can provide warmth that has nothing to do with temperature. Let their example remind you that resilience is not about avoiding hardship, but about maintaining humanity while moving through it. The fog that once rolled through London's cold streets has long since lifted. The tenements where families huddled around single candles have been replaced by homes where warmth is constant and reliable. The great houses where fires burned in every room now open their doors to visitors who can experience luxury that was once reserved for the very few. Time has carried us far from those cold Victorian winters, but the human experiences we've explored together, the struggle for dignity, the search for meaning, the creation of warmth through connection, these remain as relevant today as they were a century and a half ago. So rest now in whatever comfort surrounds you, knowing that it connects you to generations of people who worked and hoped and struggled to create a world where fewer would be cold, where more would be safe, where the ancient challenge of winter survival would gradually give way to the luxury of winter comfort. Let the quiet rhythm of your breathing slow and deepen, like the breathing of all those Victorian people who found ways to sleep despite the cold, who woke each morning with determination to face whatever the day might bring, who discovered that warmth is something that can be created not just through fuel and shelter, but through care, community, and the stubborn insistence that life, even difficult life, is worth living fully. The winter they knew has passed into history, but the warmth they created through endurance, through connection, through the patient work of making life better for those who would come after, that warmth continues to surround us still, invisible but real, like the heat that rises from well-tended fires and spreads gently through warm, quiet rooms where people can rest safely until spring arrives. Sleep well, knowing that their struggles helped create the comfort in which you rest, that their resilience contributed to the security you enjoy, and that the warmth that cradles you tonight carries within it the accumulated care of generations who understood that true comfort comes not from avoiding all difficulty, but from facing whatever challenges arise with dignity, community, and hope. The Victorian winter is over. The cold has lifted, the fires have done their work, and you are warm. Thank you for joining me on this gentle journey through time. If this quiet exploration has brought you comfort, please like this video and subscribe for more peaceful travels through history's forgotten corners. Sweet dreams wherever you are, and may your own winter nights be filled with the warmth of safety, comfort, and rest.